Hi, everyone, and welcome to An Evening with Authors. I'm very excited to be hosting tonight's conversation with our guests, Susan Uehara Rakstang and Kelly Fumiko Weiss. My name is Emma Saito Lincoln. I'm the Legacy Center Director for the Japanese American Service Committee here in Chicago. The JASC Legacy Center is a library and archives devoted to preserving the history and culture of the Japanese American community here. If you aren't already familiar with the full suite of services and programs available through JASC, please visit our website to learn more and to sign up for our e-newsletter to stay up to date on our latest programs and events. Before I introduce tonight's guests, I have a few quick announcements to make. First, please make sure that you can see the chat or comments thread on whatever device you happen to be using tonight. You may need to change your display settings in either Facebook or YouTube to make sure that you're showing the comments. This will enable you to see messages from JASC staff throughout the event, but it will also be the mechanism for you to submit questions when we get to the audience Q&A portion during the last half hour of the program. Please do try to hold your questions for Susan and Kelly until we get to that Q&A session. That will make it a little bit easier for our staff person who's moderating the chat to make sure that we don't miss any questions. Next, I'd like to mention that today is the last day of JASC's Giving Tuesday campaign. And this year we were extremely fortunate to receive a matching grant from the RRF Foundation for Aging. This allowed us to effectively double the first $5,000 received over the past 2 weeks. If you're able to, please consider making a donation today in support of JASC's programs, which include essential services such as our adult day services, our home support services, and our out-of-the-house program. These programs are the embodiment of one of JASC's 4 main pillars, Keiro no Kokoro, which means respect for our elders. JASC welcomes donations at any time, and I encourage you to keep us in mind as you plan your year-end charitable giving. You can text a donation pledge to 773-900-5656, or you can visit the JASC website for access to the donation form. One great new way to support our organization is to make a purchase through our brand new bookstore. And thanks to a partnership with bookshop.org, a portion of the proceeds from every title purchased from our recommended lists is donated to JASC, and another portion of the proceeds goes directly to support local independent bookstores. They could really use a helping hand this year. Please check out our bookstore for a great selection of titles for all ages on a wide variety of topics. Now, on to the main event. I'm delighted to welcome Susan Uehara Rakstang, author of Cooking for Her Eyes, and Kelly Fumiko Weiss, author of The Stories We Choose Not to Tell. It's wonderful to be able to feature not one, but 2 Chicago-based Japanese-American women who have published new books this year, and I'm so excited for our conversation tonight. Susan was born in Hawaii to parents of Okinawan descent and moved to Chicago when she was 3. She completed degrees at Northern Illinois University and the University of Illinois, Chicago, and enjoyed a long career as an architect prior to becoming an author. Her first book, the light is not very good, but Cooking for Her Eyes, Transcription of a Sonata, a story of music, food, love, and death, is a beautifully written memoir that covers a lot of emotional ground with grace and clarity. It's also likely to leave you hungry. And if you've been following her posts on the JASC Food and Cooking Facebook group, you already know about her talent in the food arena. And if you haven't been following along, please join that Facebook group because there is incredible, inspiring photographs of food being posted there all the time. Kelly lives in Chicago with her husband and daughter. And when she isn't writing books, she manages the IT department at a large nonprofit organization. She is a member of the Chicago Writers Association, a writer on Chanillo.com, and a co-host of the podcast Women Know IT. Kelly holds degrees from Boston University and the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. Her debut science fiction novel, The Cube, was published in 2018. And her new novel, The Stories We Choose Not to Tell, takes her writing in a new direction that is connected to her own family's experiences at the incarceration camps. Her new book is a poignant story crafted in a unique way that weaves together the perspectives of a well-developed cast of characters. It made me cry in the best way possible. Welcome, Susan and Kelly. Shall we dive in?
Sure.
To get things started, just in case we have folks in the audience who haven't had a chance to read your books yet, I wonder if you could each give a brief elevator pitch to describe your book. And we can start with Susan, because it looks like Kelly's muted.
Okay. First, I want to offer my thanks to JASC for sponsoring and making this event happen, to fellow author Kelly Fumiko Weiss and moderator Emma Saito Lincoln, the tech staff, Maria and JJ, and special thanks to you, the audience, for joining us. This is the first time I've done this, so I'm a little nervous. And elevator pitches are so difficult because my book is 258 pages, and so to chunk it down. Well, anyway, I'm using up my time. In my book, Cooking for Her Eyes, I beckon my readers to embrace their senses, seeing, smelling, hearing, taste, touch, and I ask that they join me on a journey of music, food, love, and death. The memoir is a collection of remembrances of my passion for music and art, starting at a young age, and cooking lessons from my mother. It's also about experiences in graduate school in the 1970s, working full-time in architectural offices, facing gender issues. After all, it was 1970s. All the while juggling responsibilities at home as a wife and mother of 2 children. After nearly 30 years of practicing architecture, I chose to retire so I could spend more time with my aging mom, whose health was faltering. And at the same time, I became a health advocate for my friend Margaret, a pastry chef, who was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer of her tongue. I drew from the life experiences that I wrote about in the beginning of the book to help guide me in caring for the 2 women whom I deeply loved. For my mother, I found the patience needed to help her through her cognitive decline, the same kind of patience she gave me during my childhood cooking lessons. And for Margaret, I mustered up the will of an architect to develop a cooking technique for 2- and 3-dimensional pureed foods because I wanted to nourish her, delight her spirit. And because Margaret suffered terrible pain and loss of taste during her cancer treatment, I cooked for her eyes.
Thank you, Susan. Kelly, are you ready?
Thank you so much, Susan. I loved your book. I can't wait to talk to you about it. And thank you so much to the JASC for this opportunity of having us both on. It's really an honor, and I've been coming to the JASC for Holiday Delight and all sorts of other things for many years. So it's almost surreal to sort of be a part of the programming tonight, and I really, really appreciate it. And it's been a pleasure to get to know folks there. My book is fiction. It's a story of 3 generations of Japanese American women, and it centers around Angela. And when she finds out her grandmother has passed, she also finds out she's pregnant. And so it goes to the past as she's learning about her grandmother's life as she's preparing for this future baby, and how she does and doesn't deal with that. And as the whole family sort of deals with the death of the matriarch of the family, the stories that we do and do not tell each other about our lives and our histories come out. And so it's a contemporary story. All of the stories that take place in the past are static, told through tape recordings and or journal entries. And so it is a present day tale. And I hope it resonates with folks, and I'm really excited to talk more about it tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. Your books both definitely resonated with me. And one aspect that I especially appreciated being a brand new resident of the city of Chicago is that both of the books are set against the backdrop of this city that I will now get to explore. So a little different from the main focus tonight, which is sort of the Japanese American themes that run through everything. But that was another thing that kind of ties these two books together for me, even though, you know, one is nonfiction, one is fiction. But thank you again for being here and for engaging in this conversation. I think next, if you could, I know that you each read each other's books, so if you could share what struck you most about each other's books or what resonated the most with you as you were reading. And whoever wants to go first can just.
I can't wait.
Sure.
So three things really jumped out at me, Susan, with your book. The first was, as a woman in IT, I am still very often the only woman in the room, and in IT management especially. And so your stories of paving the path for women in architecture really jumped out to me, and unfortunately still resonated with me here in 2020. But they really they felt very close to my working experience. And so that was one thing that really jumped out. Another thing that jumped out was you sort of had a revelation in the book of sort of the difference of being Okinawan and Japanese, and sort of you had kind of an aha moment when you're like, what, I'm not Japanese. And the heritage lines that we draw with our experiences. My Ji-chan, my grandfather, his last name is Taira, and we've been told our whole lives that's not a very Japanese name. And he's from Hawaii, but his family's from Okinawa. And I had the pleasure of going to Okinawa on a vacation. And I saw that name, Taira, just sort of everywhere on the island. And I was like, oh, there are places where we come from. And so that was another thread that really jumped out. And towards the end of the book, your bravery in telling the story of your mother's passing, it's such an intimate moment. And I was crying. I mean, Susan, I was just crying while I read that. But I just thought it was so vulnerable and brave for you to write that. And that car ride from one hospital to the other, I really felt that moment. And so those are sort of three. I could say so many more, but just to start, those are three things that really jumped out as I was reading your book. And I just thought it was really brave of you to give such a window into your life and your world. And I really, I loved reading it. So
thank you. Kelly, just so the audience knows, Kelly and I have never met. And it's amazing as I read Kelly's book, how many intersections we had in common. It just really amazed me. We had geographical intersections, that is Hawaii and Chicago. And we're from Hawaii. My parents, my brother and I were born there. And when I was 3, as Emma said, we moved to Chicago. What resonated with me the most were the tape recordings of Aiko, grandmother of the protagonist, Angela. I just found it so striking because she talked about things my parents never did. As a third generation or sansei, many nisei, second generation, like my parents, didn't talk about the war, didn't talk about discrimination. It was too painful. It was embarrassing. They were ashamed. And so they just didn't talk about it. And I didn't realize that we even had incarceration until I was in high school, when I read in my history book a couple paragraphs that happened. And my parents just chose not to talk about it, so when I saw your title, Stories We Choose Not to Tell, I thought, oh boy, this is going to be familiar. Aiko, Angela's grandmother, lived during World War II, as did my parents. And since Hawaii was predominantly Asian, my parents were not incarcerated as Aiko was. But my parents still felt the stabbing wounds of heightened discrimination, primarily due to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. My father was there. He was in the Army, U.S. Army. And in the tape recordings, Aiko said, back then I was still nervous about being around too many other Japanese people. We were trying to assimilate, to blend in. And that's from chapter 8, page 40. Aiko's statement corroborated what I inherently believed but didn't hear from my parents, that this was why they settled in an all-white neighborhood in Chicago, to blend in, to assimilate, and not congregate. And like Aiko, I believe my parents were afraid to live too close to other Japanese Americans as well, because the American government told them, don't. So I was really touched by hearing it. It was almost like out of the mouth of my parents, although it wasn't. I mean, she had a different experience, but it was very heartening. But on a lighter note, Aiko always wanted to be a tap dancer, which I found hilarious, not only because she was elderly, but because my mom loved to belly dance. And so they had a lot in common. So I think those things really, really did touch my heart. And I really appreciate you doing that, Kelly.
Oh, I love that so much.
I can tell already we're going to have a great evening. I bet you we could talk a lot longer than the hour and a half that's scheduled. So building on what you've just shared, and to reiterate for the audience, both of your books are deeply personal, but one is autobiographical and one is fictional. Mm-hmm. So for Susan, I'm wondering, what challenges would you have faced if you had tried to fictionalize your story? And for Kelly, on the flip side, what challenges would you have faced if you had tried to write directly about your own family's experiences?
I thought about fictionalizing my book for just a moment. It would have been easier writing a memoir. I felt compelled to get permission from the people that I name by name. But fiction just didn't work with me for a few reasons. I wanted the readers to know my mother's name. I wanted them to know who she was, what she looked like, her values, her wisdom. And I wanted the readers to know how and why cooking delicious, beautiful food was so important to her. I also wanted the same for Margaret. Because I dealt with both women's medical complexities, it was important to be as factual as possible. For instance, Margaret had pain in her mouth for over a month, and when we met, we discussed that and decided that, yeah, she should see the doctor right away. She did, and luckily, the doctors caught her cancer just in time. So that's a real story. I attended meetings that my mother and Margaret had with their doctors. I took copious notes, and I worked from those notes in writing the memoir. I wanted people who might find themselves or their loved ones in similar situations to relate to my story and to give them hope.
To write a contemporary story, I think we have a lot of literature out there about the Japanese internment camps. There's a lot of books out there. I haven't read too many about my generation's viewpoint on it. And so I wanted to get that out there in a very approachable way. And I didn't necessarily think that my personal life story was what I wanted to say. I think that there are just parts of my life that would complicate the overall theme. And so, and I agree with Susan, it was easier. It was easier to fictionalize. Well, it gives you so much more license when you can make the characters up and make, I'm sure that even in memoirs, there are certain things you smooth over and corners you may cut, but I didn't have to, think about it in that way. I could really just focus on the story. I don't know if I'll ever be brave enough to write a memoir, maybe, but I think it takes a lot of courage to do that. Yeah.
It's so fascinating to me, your two perspectives on really the same heart of the matter, but you're coming at it from these slightly different angles. And Kelly, I love that in your author's note, before the novel starts, you do address the connection between your own family's experience and this fictional story that you have created. And I loved the emphasis that you put on the importance of names. And Susan, you were also saying how important it was for people to know the name of your mother and the name of Margaret. And Kelly, you also made essentially the same statement in your author's note, how important it is to say their names and to know their names.
There's a very famous photo of a group of people lined up in front of a train on their way to the camps, and that's my family. And I've been working a long time to try and get their names on record with that photograph, and I've had varying degrees of success. And so I just thought, well, here's my book. I'm gonna, if they're, we're gonna get their names there. But I put the author's note in to ground the book, also just frankly to give it a little legitimacy, so that folks know that I'm coming to this story honest, that I understand these families' experiences as I'm writing about them. But it really just is a tribute to my grandmother. She just turned 95. She's still with us, and I've had the real pleasure of hearing her stories. She actually came to my high school and gave a speech to our class about her experience in the internment camps. And I just really wanted to make sure that even though I wasn't telling her specific story, that people knew that it absolutely informed every single part of the book. Same with my mother and her experiences, and my sisters and there too in many ways. So my heart is in there, even if it's a fictionalized book. Yeah.
Oh, it absolutely comes through. Yeah. So I'm curious a little bit about process. I'm not much of a writer myself, but I appreciate writing. I'm a voracious reader. And I would love to know what you might have edited out of your books. What didn't we get to read? Or what did you maybe really want to include, but for various reasons you had to leave on the cutting floor?
I'll go.
Sure.
Remembrances of my childhood through my career showed the tools and experiences I acquired over time to eventually help my mother and Margaret years later. I didn't want to veer too far from those experiences, but as I examined my life during this process of memoir writing, I had remembrances of other issues that I eventually sketched out in writing, but I didn't include them in my memoir. I thought that it would interrupt the rhythm of the story. It would take the reader's focus off my mom and Margaret, and the essays would be better suited as standalone writings. So those essays were about experimental writing, facing discrimination as a child, and how music truly affects my well-being. And I'll post them on my website at a later date, but they were things that I wrote. It's like looking up a word in a dictionary. Along the way, you find all these other interesting words. And it was the same with my remembrances. I was delving into a certain issue, and then other issues came up. But I left them alone for later.
Yeah, I thought about this question a lot. full disclosure, we got some of the questions in advance, so I've been thinking about them. There wasn't anything specific that I left out, but there are a lot of stories from my own life of racism I faced, or my own sort of anxiety of being half Japanese, that I definitely could have put in, but I didn't want it to seem like I was just complaining the whole time, or like, I don't know. I wanted the 3 generations to really filter through, and I wanted to talk. I wanted it to be Angela's story, but I didn't want to take away from Aiko and Judith, and so some of those didn't make it in. What I would really love is for my mother's generation to tell more about their experiences in Chicago, being a kid in the 50s and 60s, and what that experience was like. Like I said, there's a lot of stories out there about the actual camps, but there's a missing part of our literature where we talk about what that was like for those kids growing up at that time. And I just didn't feel like that was my story to tell. And I also think that my daughter's generation, I married a white man. She's only a quarter Japanese, and she's almost 11. We've had a lot of talks, particularly this year, about race in America, and she's identifying as a white person in this country. And so there's going to be a lot of stories that her generation also tells about what connection they feel to their past and their heritage, and it'll be really fascinating to see her growing up and see what she clings to and what she doesn't. My Japanese heritage has been such a huge foundational part of my life and who I consider myself to be. It will be very interesting as she grows up that that's not the case for her. And so I don't necessarily know if it's something I left out of my book, but there are more stories I think that need to be told, that I don't necessarily know if they're my place to tell.
Well, I, for one, would be thrilled if you had another book to share with us. And I especially agree with you about how wonderful it would be to hear more of the stories from the resettlement period in Chicago, the 50s and the 60s, when there was a thriving community here. Mm-hmm. And you're right, the documentation tends to focus on the incarceration experience, and there's less in our archives and less in the published world about that period. So maybe there's a project in there we could team up on.
Yeah, I just think it was a part of that time to not talk about it, right? That's just, you know, my mom and I are very close, and she tells me a lot of stories, but I can tell there are just things that she's almost trained herself not to talk about. So I think there's a lot there.
Is she interested in writing, your mom?
No, I think she should write her memoir. I think her memoir would be amazing. So I don't know if she's on this call or not, but Mom, if you are, you should write your memoir. I think she has quite the life story. Yeah.
I agree. Mom, if you're out there, please write us a book. We'll host you for a book talk. So if I understand correctly, both of your books started out in kind of a non-traditional book format. Susan, yours kind of grew out of a blog. Do I have that right? And Kelly, yours started as serialized installments on Chinillo.com. So I'm curious to know how each of you decided to take this content and put them into published form, into the more traditional book format, and whether or not that required significant revision or additional writing. I'm curious about that evolution of your writing. I think we're in a very interesting time now where writing can start off in so many different forms before it makes it into a book, and sometimes it doesn't need to make it into a book form in order to, I don't know, live its best life as a piece of writing.
Yeah, my book did start as a blog, The Art and Architecture of Puree, and it was mostly to highlight the foods, the pureed foods that I made for Margaret. And what prompted me to do it is my life was all about cancer, tongue cancer, Margaret's tongue cancer. And in spending so much time in the hospital with her or in the waiting room and talking to other people, cancer has a lot of side effects, some of them being dysphagia, which is trouble swallowing. And it's not just for people with throat cancer or tongue cancer. It's a lot of different cancers will cause, probably because of all the medications they're on. And I wanted to share these pureed dishes that I developed. And then I left it alone. After I wrote the blog, got out the information, I did what I set out to do, and I didn't touch it for years. And then my mom passed away. And while my blog did include a little bit about my mom, I wanted to write about her. I wanted to memorialize her because both my mom and Margaret were also very close. And the fact that I spent a lot of time with each of them, back and forth, I didn't really express that very much in the blog. And so I decided I want to write about my mom and Margaret, but I want to feature my mom as front and center, more so than I did in the blog.
Yeah, this is a story I've been writing on and off for a very long time. And my first book, I actually took time off of work to really dive into and complete. And there's only so many times in life you can do that, you know. Girls got to make a living. So there's this great website, Chinillo. It's behind a paywall. You subscribe to be a part of it, but after you pay your $5 a month, you have access to all these amazing indie writers, and they post everything from poetry to long form to short form. And it's great for me because I have a community of writers that have become very good friends of mine, but I also can give myself deadlines. So I would write a chapter a week, and sometimes you skip some, but it kept me writing while my day job was doing other things. I just see a comment from my friend Marcy. Anyway, so it kept me on pace. But writing week to week is very different than writing a novel. So when I decided to take it sort of off of the paywall of the website and try and get it more exposure, it did require an extensive rewrite. And actually, when it was on Chinillo.com, it was called Amachi's America. Amachi is the camp my grandmother was in. But the rewrite was so extensive, I felt that it deserved a new title. And it took me a long time to land on the title that it had. But particularly the character of Pamela. Pamela was not in Amachi's America. And so I really, in rewriting that book, this whole additional character came out. So it was quite the process. But I wanted it to be more widely available and be able to share it with more people. And honestly, there still is nothing like having your own book in your hand. It just feels really great. So selfishly, I wanted something tangible to hold, but
you beat me to the punch. My follow-up question was, how did it feel to hold a hard copy of your book in your hands for the first time?
Oh, it's great. I'll never get over it. I mean, it's just, look at these books. It's so, I'm still a big, I don't read on a Kindle or electronic devices. I still need the book in my hand. I love reading, and it's been interesting this year. At the beginning of the pandemic, I couldn't read. I just couldn't focus. And I'm used to reading 1 or 2 books a week. And for months, from like March through maybe June, July, I just couldn't. It was just this missing part of my life, and it was very joyous over the summer when it came back and I could read again. Yeah, I have to have that book in my hand. So.
Susan, how did it feel for you when you first held that precious book in your hand?
It was a thrill. I did have a deadline. I was real eager to get the book up and out. I have aunties in Hawaii that are my mom's sisters. She had 5 sisters, and 3 are left: Nobuko, Sei, and Aiko. And every time I called them to say hi, they'd say, "Are you done with your book yet? You know we're getting old." And so they were my timeline. I couldn't wait. And so as soon as I got copies of my finished product, I got it out to Hawaii just as soon as I could. Although about 6 months earlier, I really had no idea how long it was going to take me, because, once you finish the book, that's the end of writing your book, but it's the beginning of publishing and marketing and all that. I didn't know how long it would take. So my husband and I visited Hawaii, and we delivered my manuscript, a draft manuscript, just so they had it, just so they knew what I was writing about. And honestly, if they had any exceptions to what I had to say. So that, it was a real thrill just to be able to send them the book they've been wanting for such a long time.
That must be so hard, that waiting period after you've submitted your finished manuscript, and then it's in the hands of other people, and you just have to wait while it works its way through the production process.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there is no patience like the world of publishing. You cannot publish a book without being abundantly patient. It is astounding how long things take.
So on a related note about your writing, I'm curious to know if there was a moment for either of you when you discovered that words have power, or that writing could be a means of amplifying your voice. Maybe there wasn't, maybe there was, but if there was, I'd love to hear about it.
I'll go. When I practiced architecture, I did a fair amount of technical writing. And I wrote reports, and I wrote conflict resolution papers, because there's always a conflict on a job site. And my writing had to be succinct and never stray from the facts. And I discovered that kind of writing was very empowering. I enjoyed it. But when I came to writing my memoir, and I was recalling my scenes that I include in the book, I had a completely different approach. I asked myself, what did you see at that moment? What did you smell? What did you hear and taste and touch? And I had to delve deeply into my memory bank, using my senses, to recall even the simplest events of my life. And in that recall, I found my voice. And I wanted my readers to experience the color and the smells and the sounds and the tastes as if they were in the scene with me. And so, contrary to technical writing, it was my memory that empowered me. And writing was my tool to express and bring context to those memories. So I felt empowered in 2 different ways.
I love that. I know we haven't met yet, Susan, but I feel like I'm gonna just keep chatting with you for years to come.
Yes.
I think what came to mind when you asked this question was, there was a underground newspaper magazine in high school that people would write, and you'd print it on the photocopier and pass it around. And I wrote a piece about being Japanese in that, and I got a lot of really negative feedback. A lot of people told me that I was not Japanese enough to be writing that article. And I remembered at that time that it was shocking to me that I was I'd experienced a lot of racism in my life, but I didn't know how people would react to the written word of it all. And so ever since then, that's really was the genesis of me actually writing this book, of going back and forth and being like, don't rock the boat, be passive, or no, you should tell your story, and representation matters. And growing up, there really wasn't very much for me to hold on to in the written word about mixed race characters. And it's so different for my daughter's generation. There's so much out there. And I actually read a lot of young adult fiction because I think there's a lot of really amazing things happening in that genre around representation. And, you know, that thread has sort of gone through my life of, if the stories you want aren't there, maybe you should be the one writing them. And so I had some of that same fear that when I published this book. I remember that article I wrote in high school. I thought maybe I'd get some of the same backlash, but I'm an adult now. It's different. You know, it's a book. It's not this like little zine in a high school. But that fear stuck with me, and I think that there's something to that when you say this is who I am. You're worried that people will reject that, and having felt that before, I think it is even more important that we write stories about who we are. And yeah.
As someone who's also mixed race, and I believe we probably are approximately the same age, I'm with you all the way about not having had a whole lot to read that reflected me, and also that same fear of, am I Japanese enough?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that what you just said really resonates with me. And also another plug for our bookshop, because as I was selecting titles to put in the different categories for children and young adults and adults, I was stunned, pleasantly stunned, by how much is out there. And of course, the focus was primarily on Japanese themed books or Japanese American authors, Japanese American history. But there's so much out there. And I also read quite a bit of young now, because there's so many authors who are getting published that I'm so excited to read these stories that reflect not just people like me, but of all stripes, all backgrounds. It's really a pretty exhilarating time, I think.
Yeah, there's a great
Susan
Hapa author, Sarah Kuhn, and she wrote a book called "I Love You So Mochi," and it's such an adorable book. And she's Japanese American girl, but her father's, I might get it mixed up, but one side of her family is recently immigrated from Japan, and the other side has a long history of being in America and being in the incarceration camps. And so within just her life, she has both Japanese American experiences. And I was just like, where was this book when I was growing up? It's such a lovely story.
Yeah. Susan, I'm seeing in our chat here that somebody in the audience would like to know what your aunties thought of your book once you had delivered it to them.
They loved it, but you know, I'm their niece, so but they were very touched because they were all close, even though there were thousands of miles between them, who are still in Hawaii, and my mom. They talked on the phone a lot. My mom went to Hawaii often. They came to Chicago. They were very close. And I think just reading about their sister touched them. So I felt comforted that they approved.
Approval is a good feeling, isn't it? Well, I'm seeing another question in the chat, kind of a response to what Kelly and I were both touching on about identity and being mixed and perhaps feeling not Japanese enough. And somebody's asking, what does not being Japanese enough mean? And who are the people who told us that or made us feel that way? So that kind of leads us into one of my questions that I had prepared ahead of time about, for both of you, how would you characterize your relationship with the Japanese American community, and how has that relationship changed over the course of your life? I think we can kind of fold those in together.
Yeah, I'm intimidated by this question. I think I've spent a lot of years in therapy trying to answer this question. The people that have talked to me about my race have been of all stripes and colors. And I really don't want to go down sort of the storytelling path of those experiences, but I will say that it's come from all places, even close friends or even in my own family. And I think I grew up with my mother, who is Japanese, and so I just gravitated towards that side of the family, and everyone around me was Japanese. But I don't look Japanese all the time, right? So I think that people who are Hapa see that in me, but other people, I put it in the book for a reason, that sort of question of where are you from, like, who are you kind of questions. I mean, it's just constant throughout my life. But what was the second part of your question?
It has more to do with the Japanese
my
American
relationship with it.
Particularly here in Chicago.
I honestly have a lot of fear about rejection from the Japanese American community. It's not easy for me. And I don't get as involved as I want to because of that. And I'm still working on that. And I think that, it was really prevalent throughout my 20s, but by the end of my 30s, I feel more myself. And so, as I go into my 40s, I feel more centered. And I think that I can imagine this world of being more involved in the Japanese American community. And in some ways, this book is kind of a coming out book in that way of really embracing my identity and saying, no, this is who I am. This is my family. I'm a part of this community. And it's another reason why just being part of a JASC event is really meaningful to me. But I think society has changed too. I'm not sure that I would have been so open-armed welcome in an event like this in the 80s or the 90s. I don't know, maybe I'm making that up, but it didn't seem that way growing up. So I think they've been parallel paths of me being more comfortable in my own skin, and also just representation and societal acceptance of mixed race in general has grown. So
I think there's been an expansion, right, of the umbrella that encompasses what is Japanese American. And there's more room now for conversations about voices that maybe were left out before, but no longer. All are welcome. Susan, I cut you off. What were you about to say?
No, I'd like to refer back to Kelly's book again. It was chapter 20, where Angela, her character Angela, remarked that she was very bad at being a Japanese American. And I confess I blushed, because I too felt that I was bad at being Japanese American. I spent my years on the north side of Chicago in all white neighborhoods, and the only minority among my friends. And and with my parents' belief that, assimilate, don't congregate, I had very little exposure to the Japanese American community. And as a kid and as an adult, like Angela, my work and fulfilling my family responsibilities kept me from reaching out to the community. And now that I'm retired and I'm an adult now, I have reached out a bit to the Japanese American community, and I am enjoying my new friends, and I feel like I've come home. And it's a learning process. I mean, for me, this is new. I could be Caucasian, and I would know as much as that person. I mean, I know very, very little about the community. So I'm learning and I'm enjoying it.
This is so heartwarming for me. I'm also new. I'm new to Chicago. I'm new to the JASC, and I also grew up not really identifying as Japanese American. I'm Shin Nisei, which for those in the audience who may not know, that means the half of my family that's Japanese immigrated more recently than the World War II period. And so I never really knew my place in the community either. And
and I think we can't underestimate, the rules after the war that you couldn't congregate. And I don't think we can underestimate the impact that that's had on generations to come, which is another reason I wanted to tell sort of a multi-generational story. But I'm Gosei, so my grandmother's mother was born in the United States, so it was her mother that came over, and so my grandmother didn't even know Japanese. She grew up speaking English, and so the threads of our culture are long, but we're American, so it's fascinating to identify so much with so many different sort of cultural experiences and try and figure out what that makes you. It's a lifelong journey, I think.
Well, it's wonderful to be able to create these new connections now. For me, that's just so exciting. Yeah. We're coming up on 8 o'clock soon. So we'll be switching over to audience Q&A. So for the audience, now would be the time to start typing your questions in to the comment thread. And we may not be able to get to everybody's questions, but we'll do our best. And if necessary, we'll find a way to follow up afterward if there are just way too many questions for us to get to it. But I think before we switch over to Q&A, I'd really like to ask a little bit about this year in particular and how everything that has happened this year has impacted your lives personally, but also how that has impacted your ability to market your books, because both of your books were published this year, and what a year to be debuting a book. So has it made it harder for you to write? Has it made it easier for you to write? Kelly mentioned that your longstanding habit of reading was disrupted.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say I haven't been writing this year. Writing is not, work has been all encompassing this year. I have the privilege of working from home, but in IT, when everything is relying on technology, it's been a little all consuming, and I haven't been writing. I will say that the difference between marketing this book and my first book is sort of the difference. I only have one child, but I imagine it's the difference between a first child and the second one. The first one, you're so worried about every little thing, and then the second one comes and it just doesn't, you kind of know a little bit more. But I can be fairly introverted, and so the pressure of having to try and schedule a lot of events, it was actually kind of a relief to not even have that option. But I will say that so much of marketing your book is on social media these days, and so I didn't feel like there was that much of a difference, because it's really just about getting people to post and posting about it and posting here and posting there, and so it actually felt quite familiar.
There was actually a second piece of my question before we get to you, Susan. I want to make sure, Kelly, because I know you're going to bring this up, and I want Kelly to have a chance too. And that's, given that we have this audience with us tonight, what can all of us in this community do to support you, to help get the word out about your books? And social media, obviously, a great tool at everyone's disposal.
I think there's nothing better you can do than a personal endorsement, right? So posting, hey, I just read this book and I loved it, is amazing. Putting reviews up on Goodreads and IndieBound, Amazon, wherever you get your books, also really helps. But I will say, I have not figured out the magic of marketing books yet. So if anyone knows what that magic is, please share it with me. that is not something that I'm particularly great at, but I would just say that in my experience, what sells the most or what pushes the book the most is just personal endorsements of people saying, hey, I loved this book. You guys should buy it too. So post away.
Will do. All right, Susan, your turn.
Yeah, as far as marketing, I'm a bashful person, and book launches and parties and in-person readings, all that stuff, while it helps sell books, I understand. I just would not be comfortable in it. So, being staying in place and not going to restaurants and not going to parties for my book launch, I'm relieved. I do depend on some social media, although I must say I'm still befuddled over Instagram. I'll have to get lessons from you, Kelly. But this virtual evening with authors has been just so delightful, a lot of fun. And I'm in my comfort zone as opposed to throwing a party for myself for my book. I cannot picture myself doing that. So as far as what the audience members can do, I have a website, coincidentally called Cooking for Her Eyes, and I invite the audience to visit it. I write about stories behind the story itself, and I showcase my pottery and architectural drawings and essays and sketches. And there's even a little button that's called Purchase This Book that the audience is welcome to press anytime, and tell your friends about it. Tell your friends about Kelly's book and my book, and just get the word out. We would appreciate that.
And hey, the holidays are coming up. So if you're looking for a great gift to give, both of these books have my endorsement, my wholehearted endorsement. So it really does help, right? Sharing your delight in a book and spreading the word. So everyone
Oh, you're
get
good
out
at
there.
marketing. Kelly, that's good.
No, I understand you. My first book, I could not think to have a launch party, and a dear friend of mine planned it and threw it for me because she knew I wouldn't do it for myself. And this year when I launched this book, there's a lovely bookstore in Lincoln Square called The Bookseller, and the owner of that store, Susie, is just the salt of the earth, and she was kind enough to do a virtual event when my book came out. And I agree with you, Susan. It was so nice to be at home in my comfort zone. And you putting yourself out there and the vulnerability of this work you've spent so much time on, it was really nice to be home for that. So I really understand that a lot.
I'm glad we successfully created a safe space for this to happen. And I'm seeing we have a highlight here, a comment from Allie, who's a college student in New Jersey who tuned into the panel. And she says both of you have really made an impact on her experience. So that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, Allie. We really appreciate that. And thank you for joining us from New Jersey. I have family in New Jersey. And all right, I see we're starting to get some questions in. Susan, it looks like there's one for you, asking if you could explain your love of music and your writing. So I take that to mean, could you speak more about your love of music and its connection to your writing?
Yeah, I played the piano when I was young, and I've always loved classical music. So does my husband. We go to a lot of concerts. And when I was, I had all of my notes, and I wanted to start writing Cooking for Her Eyes, my first book. I had no idea where to begin. And in the background was music, Beethoven, and I was very familiar with all of his pieces. And then this one piece came on. It's Sonata number 8 in C minor, and its nickname is Pathétique. And I was listening, oh, that's nice. And then I had an epiphany, because as I listened to it closer, it was my life. It was what I wanted to write this memoir. The sequence was different, but the music was just gorgeous. And my story, I felt, relayed right to that sonata. And so that's when I decided to organize my memoir as Beethoven organized this sonata. And it needed to be freestanding because some people are not interested in Beethoven or classical music. So it did have to be freestanding. But for those people who were into classical music, I've gotten a lot of really good feedback on that. So it was experimental writing. I just needed to do it.
I love that link between your writing and your thoughts and your emotions and the music that surrounded
And that's
you.
a very emotional piece. It's very dramatic.
Yeah.
Beethoven was very dramatic. And I felt that the situation I was in, not the beginning of my book, but once Margaret was diagnosed, it just followed. As Beethoven had many key changes in one of his movements, which represents instability, that's when Margaret and I were just trying to understand what this cancer was and what the impact would be and what her future, it just matched so easily. I had to first analyze the whole sonata, so that took time. But once I got that done, and my music theory teacher helped me, I didn't know how to do that. I was analyzing simple pieces, but Dr. Nomi Epstein worked very patiently with me. And once I got that done, then all I had to do was just slip in my story in the places that matched the sonata.
It's beautiful. All right, I'm going to take a quick look at our other questions coming in. We have one that's asking, what advice do you have for the next generation of Japanese Americans to embrace their culture? And I think this is a perfect question for the two of you because you both have children. So you are well positioned to have an opinion about the next generation.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest takeaway is don't be scared. Don't have the fear that you won't be accepted. And if someone doesn't accept you, that's their problem, not yours. It's taken me decades to learn this. And to just keep telling our stories. So as I said, my daughter might not identify with her Japanese heritage as much as I do, but I still tell her the stories. And I know that eventually they will mean something to her, and they might mean something different to her. But I think that we have to shed the multiple generations of keep your stories to yourself, and we have to share our stories. And I think that Gen Z's got it down. I'm not too worried about them. There's just a lot of they just embrace multiculturalism in a way that I didn't have when I was growing up. So I think they're going to teach us a lot, actually, about how to embrace our culture. And I think they're going to teach us a lot about how to be more accepting of who we are. And so I think let's learn from them.
I love that. I love that.
And I think joining organizations like JASC would be very helpful for the children to be around people that look like them. That was something I didn't have as a kid. I didn't see people that look like me. I remember when Benetton's campaign for all the colors of Benetton or something, and there would be big banners in stores, and there are all these different colored faces, beautiful little faces of children. And I thought, boy, if I was a kid, I would have really have appreciated that. And so I think in that way that hasn't changed, and that kids like to be around diversity, I think because our population is getting more and more diverse, but because we're Japanese, there is a rich culture that I would hate for them to miss.
I agree. Let's see. Looks like Allie has a question. wondering if either one of you has any advice for future social workers involving cultural competence.
Yay for social workers! My master's degree is in social service administration, so I love this question. I think that this is probably a question for a different conversation. There's a lot of different layers to how to do this and how to do this well. But I think that when you are thinking about cultural competency in the world of social services, it is about embracing people who they are and not projecting anything onto them. So it's about letting them self-identify. And I think that that's super important, particularly in social services. So that's my very short answer to a very complicated question.
Thank you, Kelly. Let's see. I have a question from Henry. Susan, I loved the backstories with your mom. How did you recall in such detail the events during your youth? Were those events ones that you wanted to remember or ones that already had a deep impact on you? My own memories are waning and I fear losing touch with some of those jewels of the past.
Some of those memories, Henry, I think of our brain as like the hard drive of our computer. Everything is in there. And when you want to retrieve a file, you go to the directory, you know exactly what you're looking for, and all of a sudden it's there. And there were memories I hadn't thought about in decades, but I was on a certain subject matter, and it was like a treasure hunt. I just went searching for it. And no, they weren't necessarily huge, didn't necessarily have a huge impact on my life, or so I thought, but apparently it did, because those memories were there. They just came up. As an example, one part was when I was in the living room and I was getting ready to spend the night at the Evanston Arts Center because I was in their pottery program and I was going to do kiln watching. And so I was first in my living room, and then I got to the studio and I started writing about the studio. And my editor said, "Wait a minute, are you making pottery in your living room? How did you get there?" And I thought, okay, well, this is what, to myself, I realized that I needed to do a transition. And I remembered the streets and the trees. I remember the traffic. I remember the driveway. I remember stopping and looking at Lake Michigan because this art center was right on the lake. And so I think if you beckon a memory or a subject matter and you dig deeply enough, you can find it. At least I did. And I was just awed because I don't have the best memory. But when there's a purpose, somehow the brain comes through and didn't let me down.
Yeah, I'll just say too, when I wish I would have talked to my grandmother even more before her memory started going. At 95, her memory is not what it once was. But the Alphawood Gallery here in Chicago did a great exhibit a few years ago, and I took my grandmother, and there was the picture of her and her family blown up. And when she saw that picture on the wall, she started telling stories that none of us had ever heard before. And so there is just this recall that can happen. I totally agree with you, Susan. And I wish I had been recording her as she was saying those stories. And they did a little oral history project. And when we got her in front of the microphone and started asking her questions, she wasn't having that same sort of visceral memory. We still got some of her stories on tape, but just standing in front of that picture even. So I think that there are lots of ways that photos, tactile things, smells that can just really bring it back. Yeah.
That's fascinating, Kelly, what you said about the difference in the stories, the rawness that you were getting from her in that moment when she was reacting to the photo just with you versus the shift that happened once she was in front of a camera for a more formal, structured oral history recording. And it's a little disheartening for me, given that I work in the archives realm, because of course we rely on documentation to help us preserve this history. And it could be written documentation, it can be photographs, it can be artifacts, it can be recordings, audio or video. And I strongly encourage anyone out there, whether you're part of the Japanese American community or another community, to consider recording the stories of your family. And Kelly's book is structured in this way where it really highlights the value of these audio tapes that have interviews conducted by a daughter with her mother, and the value of those tapes to the next generation. And that really got me in the feels, because audiovisual preservation is what my background is in. And I've always kind of instinctively known the value of those recordings. But I think you're right that there's a difference between what someone says when they know they're being recorded versus what they might say in a raw,
and I think to know that your stories are important. So, a lot of times when I try and talk to my family, there's a sense of, well, this is just my story. It's not important. But everyone's story is important. And as my grandmother ages into her 90, and I think it's important, especially for my mother's generation, for us to start writing their stories down, right? And so I think that there is value to every human experience. And so, going back to the question about how can we, share our culture with younger generations, it is knowing your value and knowing that your story is important. Every human story is.
Susan, was there anything you wanted to add on that topic?
No, I agree with Kelly. I think everybody has a story in them. It's a matter of will. Do they want to bring it out? It was exhausting, especially memoir writing. There's a reason why a person wants to write a memoir. They had a life-changing experience, but everyone has a story, and they can tell it in their own way. Now, writing does have certain prescriptions, and I highly recommend hiring an editor, because they can read not just for grammar, but also for content and development. So, no, it was a wonderful experience, and anyone who is interested in writing one, I'd say go for it. It's like a journey into your mind, because you have to dig up all that stuff. Some of it not so nice, but if it pertains to the story you want to tell, you just write about it. And it's cathartic, actually.
That actually touches on one of the questions that we didn't have time for that maybe we can squeeze in now, which is this acknowledgement that the memories can be painful, or the elements of the story that you're telling can be painful and emotional. And both of your books touch on death and profound loss. And I'm curious if in your own lives you found any traditions or processes for yourself that have helped you through that grieving?
Writing about death was the most difficult part to write. Just for some suggestions to others in helping the grieving process, my own experience, I found the memorial service at Midwest Buddhist Temple very comforting. But I want to talk a little bit about death. Before there's death, there's dying. And we have no control, very little control over death. When our body and mind says it's time to go, it's time to go. But we do or could possibly have control over dying and how we want to die. And in my experience, I discovered that the multidiscipline care team of hospice provided comfort to my mother, even though she was unconscious. They were very respectful, which was comforting to me. And also a spiritual advisor, in my case, it was Reverend Ron at Midwest Buddhist Temple, can bring comfort to your mind and spirit. I believe that support is the key to controlling how we die. We can go out kicking and screaming, writhing in pain, or we can accept hospice services, and they and the spiritual advisor will help us reconcile that it is time for us or a loved one to go. And they will leave this earth with dignity, peace, and grace. I believe that. So it's not just death itself, but it's also dying. And I think most people, if they're afraid of something, it's about dying. It's, once they're dead, they're dead. But will it be painful? It'll be scary. I don't want to leave. I'm not done doing everything I want to do. Well, the hospice care team helps the patients as well as the family. It's a wonderful process that brought me a lot of comfort. And I think it made my grieving a little bit easier. I still had to go through it, but and then when I wrote my memoir, I went through it all over again when I was writing about my mom. But, it was so nice to remember her with such detail, which I hadn't done really before I wrote.
Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts, Susan. It's really a lot to think about, and a wonderful endorsement of hospice care. And I think there's a lot to be learned from those who've been at the side of someone going through this process. So thank you so much for opening up with all of us tonight. Kelly, did you have any thoughts?
Oh, I can't say it better than that. I'm going to leave it with Susan on that one. That was beautiful.
Yeah. I agree. I don't think it can be said better than Susan just said it. And all of us experience loss in our families or in our friend circles. And it's something we don't talk about enough, I think. So I think the more we can create room for that kind of conversation, the easier it becomes. As Susan, as you said, it doesn't change the fact that you have to go through the grieving, but there are certain topics that have always had this kind of cone of silence around them. And maybe we can start to change that.
But it's not like that in Japan, right? They celebrate every spring cherry blossom season, and the blossoms represent the fragility of life. And so and they would have picnics and parties to celebrate life and death. And knowing that these petals aren't going to last long, they just revel during the time that they are alive. And I think they view, I'm not sure, although I did send I wrote an essay on that, and I sent it to my friend who was born in Japan. And I said, is this about right? Or am all I'm doing is research, and it's just on paper. I don't know if it's true, or how it would resonate. And my friend said, yeah, that's it. So even kids as a child, they recognize life and death. Whereas here, I don't think we do that. And so that's why we're afraid of it. But it's just living your life fully, because you will die, and that's not a bad thing, supposedly.
So I think the lessons of the evening are: don't be afraid, embrace your identity, live your life to the fullest, love people deeply. I took that away from your books.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a few minutes left. I do see a question specifically for Susan, but I think it applies to both of you, is, have you started your next book? Are you thinking about your next book?
I'm thinking about my next book, but I got to tell you, writing, I have so much respect for writers, because never having done it before and jumping in and doing it, it's hard work. It's very hard work. So right now I'm just chilling, and I'm noodling and putting together my website and writing short essays. But I'm thinking about writing another book. I just don't know if I have enough time. I'm pretty old. if
You definitely do. You should keep writing. Your book is too good for you to stop now.
If it takes as long to write my second book as it did my first book, I don't think I have enough time to finish. Maybe one of my kids will finish it. I'll get it started.
I have my third book drafted. So I again used Chanillo to do the weekly installments, and I got through from start to finish. And so now it's that process of taking it and changing it into a novel format. It's a story about, it's a rom-com actually, but it's about a woman working in IT. And it was another area where I just felt like I haven't read any books about what that experience is like. And I love rom-coms. So it's just sort of a story I wanted to tell about what it's like to be a woman in this field of work, but then also just adding something that I really like. But it takes place mostly in an office setting. And so it's felt really weird to try and work on it this year when we're all not in offices anymore. And so I'm really letting it sit, because I can't decide if I want to let that stand, or if I want to incorporate some of the work from homeness that I've experienced this year into it. And I don't think that I'm through the looking glass yet of what 2020 means to make those sort of decisions. So I don't know if I'm going to work on it and finish it until somewhere in next year, when the lessons of this year are a little bit clearer to me. But the first draft is done. But after that, I have no idea.
That's fantastic. I look forward to seeing it when it takes its final form. And I can completely understand how things may be a little raw still from this year and this unusual work environment that we're all in. Folks, we are seeing your comments coming through that are popping up on the screen, of people thanking Susan and Kelly for joining us. And we really do appreciate that. Thank you for the feedback. I know I've had a fantastic evening with you two. I feel like we could get together for coffee someday when the pandemic is over and really enjoy even more conversation.
Oh, I would love that. Let's absolutely do that.
Yeah.
And a few minutes left, so if anyone has any last minute questions they want to pitch to us, go right ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to make another plug for both books. Folks, they're easy to purchase online. It's not too late to get copies to give as gifts. They're both really, truly worth the read. And also a plug for JASC, that it takes a team to put on a program like this. You're seeing my face, but there's a whole team of people supporting us today and prior to the event. So thank you goes out to all of them, to Maria and JJ and Shalini and Joan. And it really does help us produce this kind of program, but it also helps us provide all of our cultural programming and all of our programming for our elders. I love that when I go to work, sometimes not currently because of the pandemic, but I love that when I go to work, I share the building with the folks who are participating in our adult day services. It brings a smile to my face every day. And the work that JASC has done since 1946 is so crucial for the community. So anything that you can do to support us, a financial donation is always appreciated, but even just spreading the word about the work that we do and attending our events, all of that is helpful. Just like spreading the word about these books is helpful. So word of mouth, social media, whatever channels you have access to, we all appreciate the help of the community and the support of the community.
Yes, thank you so much for having us be a part of this. And Emma, it's been such a pleasure. You've done such a great job coordinating this, and to Marie and JJ and everyone, it was a real highlight of this year. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. So thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
This is my first authors event, so it's just been so much fun. It's a nice way to ease into this sort of thing. And thank you, Emma. You are amazing. You're so organized and you respond quickly and you seem on top. You always are on top of things. I really appreciate that.
Thank you. You two make it very easy. So here's to more future conversations, I hope, someday in person. And folks, if you think of questions afterward that you think, oh shoot, I should have asked that, feel free to send them in to JASC. Our contact info is on the website. You can either email the general JASC email address or email straight to me in the Legacy Center. And I would be happy to pass those questions on to Kelly or Susan. And let us know what you thought. Keep an eye out. If you registered for the event through Eventbrite, keep an eye out for a follow-up email, which will ask you to answer just a few brief follow-up survey questions. And they really do help us assess our programming and help us plan for future programming. So thank you all for joining us. I hope everyone has a happy holiday season. I hope everybody stays safe and healthy. And I hope to see folks at future events.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Emma.
Yay.
Yay.
And JJ and Maria.